more kind of stressful, right? So this is kind of a cycle, cyclical effect phenomena. I think after a while, after the American society has found out a way to deal with inequality and also to change the policies so they can include more ordinary people into the process of globalization. I believe American society will value meritocracy again. That's the world where the world should go. Okay, let me stop here.
Yeah, Professor Yang, thank you so much. A lot there for us to all digest. I found when you ended by actually trying to explain and link that the transition that the Chinese made from a central control sort of economy to a market economy, the transition was smoother as opposed to the other parts of the world because of the traditions the rooted in the belief in meritocracy and virtue, and also you link that to entrepreneurship. And I'm sure there's lots of questions that we'd like to explore more with you. If you've got any writings on that topic, perhaps you could share with us and we can share with the audience. But we have some questions here that I thought I'd quickly ask you. I think because of the current geopolitical tensions, your focus was comparing China and the United States. But you did allude to the fact that meritocracy in terms of bureaucracy does exist in other societies as well. And so one of the points made here by a participant is that meritocratic bureaucracies which promote virtue exist in other societies, ancient societies, like in the Islamic world, in the kingdoms of South Asia, and so on. And so very quickly, the question is, what makes the Chinese civilizational bureaucracy a bit more special? Or was there some distinguishing feature about the Chinese sort of bureaucracy based on meritocracy that perhaps even helps us understand the Chinese current path, which I think most will accept has been, you said, smooth, even successful?
Well, there's every culture values meritocracy because otherwise it's not here today, right? A culture can survive only if the people belonging to that culture work hard towards some goal, right? Otherwise, in the ancient time, prehistorical times, that culture should have died out. Okay, right? But what's special about Chinese political meritocracy is because it has a long history, has been there, institutionalized for more than 2,000 years, right? If I may, I can speak a little bit more why China started that early. That's because at the so-called anxious age, right? The 800 BC to 200 BC, right? Several civilizations began to develop the rules to govern the society. And the Chinese society has found just morality and also merit, self-perfection as a way to govern the society, right? So the Chinese people at that time didn't develop any religion, right? Chinese people always live in the current life, okay? So because we live in the current life, we have to live peacefully. We have to set up a government, and then we have to regulate the government. We have to select capable government and virtuous government officials. Okay, so China, in a very early stage, set up a really strong state, and that state had to be run by selected government officials. Okay, so that's why China has built such a strong meritocratic bureaucracy.
Thank you, Professor Young. I'm particularly interested in your point about the strong state. When people refer to the strong state, particularly in more Western liberal societies, the strong state is sort of conflated with something to do with authoritarian. Whereas I think you're saying that the strong state in the Chinese tradition is about creating stability based around virtue and around meritocracy. I have a question here, one more question, if you don't mind. We might take two if you keep it short, if the answers can be short. Here's a question: to what extent does the CCP's ability to control capitalist excess, which you refer to, the excess would be in any society would be corruption. And I thought your explanation was very good. It was not simply to get rid of it, but it was also to not educate the new bureaucracy about what virtues need to be upheld. But the question is, to what extent does the CCP's ability to control capitalist excess compared to the U.S. federal government's impact on students, etc., as you see in your as you used in your example, feeling difference towards whether wealth is earned or not?
I mean, how the CCP controls capital?
Excesses, yeah, and that in that way, how does it influence the Chinese view the current generation as well?
Well, that's a big question. I studied development economics. When I see many countries have failed growing their economy, one of the key obstacles in those countries is that the government has been captured by strong business interests. I think that's a universal, not just confined to developing countries, but also to developed countries, right? A country has to open up the society business to all the people in order to grow. Otherwise, strong business elites are going to control all the businesses accesses and also control the society. And then the society it just cannot grow, okay? So that's why, in the anti-corruption campaign, another objective is to get rid of the business political alliances. Okay. So business cannot control parties, cannot control society, cannot control business access. Right? So that has a lot of implication for the current young generation in China. Right. I think that they now have a more nuanced view about the market, about capital. Of course, we don't want to see that to go too far, but a nuanced view about the market is important. So we stay alert about potential monopoly with big business interests.
Professor Young, I have one final question for you, and I think it's a question that I would like to ask you, and in a way sets up, I hope, the discussion for the next panel as well. And it's related partly to the questions you've mentioned. China is changing. The China I went to only 30 years ago is today, the China today is so different from that. So the question is, given the speed of change in Chinese society, given the speed of technology, given the open market, the excesses which open markets can create, etc., which we know, I think all of us who've done some work in China know it's a major concern to the Chinese government. Do you think, and you alluded to more developed countries like the USA in a way being weakened because for the reasons you've mentioned, and some would equate that with just the pursuit of material wealth as a measure of success. and even meritocracy. So very quickly, do you see so the rapid changes in China affecting the next generation in a way that long traditions and the Confucianist traditions, the traditions of belief in hard work, meritocracy, virtue may be eroded? I know it's a loaded question, but if you could give us share your wisdom, will it be eroded given what's happening and in the globalized world with the digital sort of world we live in, even though China is very conscious of needing to protect itself from those influences?
So this is a really big question, right? Let me first say I don't think the United States has declined. It's just looking inward, right? History does not progress linearly, right? History is full of cycles. I think the United States now in a cycle of looking inward. That is, it wants to solve the problems inside its own country, right? Definitely, it has turned more conservative and is going to become conservative in the next several decades, right? Um, so that's the trend over there, right? So then China uh, probably is in a different cycle, right? China has become more successful, and China is now looking outward, right? So this kind of contrast may uh, seem to look like that China is rising, United States is declining, but I really don't think so. But of course, that's going to boost young people's confidence in China. But I think we need more confidence facing the West, particularly facing the West, right? It's kind of a long story, but let me cut. Right, I'm in the
Will Chinese
generation of the
culture decline?
1980s.
That's the question. Yeah.
Right, 1980s, right? So we observe almost everything from the West. But the young generation, the current generation, has changed. They don't think that everything from the West is rightful. Everything should be absorbed. They become more confident. I think that's important for China to look out, to go out. This is also kind of a new cycle in the Chinese culture. We'll see how this trend is going to play out in the future.
Professor Young, thank you so much for that. I know that this is probably a 2-hour lecture that you probably conduct with students, but I like to think we got the essence of your thoughts, particularly in terms of the long history and maybe the specific traits of the Chinese commitment to and respect for meritocracy and virtue that also then helped the Chinese transition from the old model to the market economy, etc., and the role of the strong state. And the strong state not defined as some military authoritarian state, but the social contract within the society and the culture. So, Professor, thank you very much for your insights. We would love to distribute any papers you have. If you upload it, we will distribute, or if you send it to us later, we can distribute it as well. So thanks very much. I will hand this back over to our moderator, Fidas. Thank you, Professor.
Okay,
Fidas,
thank
over to
you.
Thank you, Chandran, and thank you, Professor Yao, for your thought-provoking comments on meritocracy and its deep and rich history, not only in China, but parts of the Western world as well. Now, this sets the stage wonderfully for our panel discussion this afternoon. For this first panel, titled Echoes from Antiquity, Tracing China's Historic Cultural Influence and Impact, we are delighted to have Professor Martin Powers from the University of Michigan and Peking University, Dr. K.P. Shankaran from the Indian Express and St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and finally, Professor Loksang Ho from the Hong Kong Buddhist Psychology and Mental Health Association. If you have any questions for our panelists or even for the moderator, don't forget to ask them through the Q&A box below. Please remember to get a chance to win a free e-copy of Chandran's upcoming book, Understanding China. You would have to send a question and leave a review at the end of the webinar. Please note that due to the high volume of questions and limited time, we may only be able to answer a select number of questions. Now, Chandran, please take it away.
Thank you, Fidas. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. So it's my privilege now to try and moderate this very important session. We have about an hour. The topic is Echoes from Antiquity, tracing China's historical, cultural influence and impact. We have three very distinguished, learned scholars who have made it their life's work to understand these issues. Fidas has already introduced them, Professor Martin Powers, Professor K.P. Shankaran, and Professor Lok-San Ho. The way we're going to moderate it is that I'm going to ask each of the distinguished members of the panel to take 3 or 4 minutes to outline their thoughts on the topic, particularly in relation to the historical context and the impact in today. Their particular fields of expertise, each of them have looked at this from very different angles. And then once they've all made their statements for about 3 or 4 minutes, please, gentlemen, if you could stick to 3 or 4 minutes for your opening remarks, then we'll open up for a discussion, which I will moderate for about 30 minutes, and then we would open up for the floor. So to the audience, please send your questions forward, and I'll do my best to try and pose it to the panel. Let me start by inviting Professor Martin Powers to make his opening remarks. And Professor Powers, I'm really interested. I read your CV. I don't have time here to tell everyone about how distinguished your areas of study are, but I'm particularly interested in your issue around the sort of whole question of the morality issue of culture embedded in the Chinese system as well. So over to you, Professor Powers.
Yes, I think very few people understand how profound was China's impact on the Enlightenment and some of these ideas we think of as modern Western ideas. Many Enlightenment scholars regard secular morality as one of its key insights. And this owes a good deal to China. As you know, the problem with situating authority in religion is that it's essentially unchecked. The aristocracy, the king can do whatever they want because God won't come down and contradict them. So in the 17th century, European philosophers were reading translations of Chinese, of the Confucian books, basically. And they said, well, oh, this is very good moral thinking, but there's no religion and no religious wars. Let's learn from that. And as you know, Jefferson and Madison and others embraced this idea of separating church and state. But if the chief executive isn't making these decisions about government, then who should do it? And in China, the idea of Wu Wei was very important. This Taoist idea that the chief executive keeps his hands off, basically, and lets the experts run the government. So you need some, but then how do you choose the experts? Well, I think one of China's most brilliant insights really was what I call the tally model. In Chinese, it's based on the metaphor of a tally, 名实相符. So basically, you have authority is when you have a match between the officer's charge and the officer's performance. And here's also where public and private come in. As long as the officer is carrying out his charge and then he's benefiting the public, or she's benefiting the public. If they use their office for personal benefit, then that is corruption. This whole notion of corruption was introduced to England via Chinese texts. And so let's say you're the head of the EPA, you need to know about science, you need to know about environmental science. But in addition, as Dr. Yang was saying, you need virtue. Well, what that word means in Chinese from ancient times onwards is dedication to the public interest. So every official had to have expertise and dedication to the public interest. Without both of those, they weren't carrying out their charge, and so they wouldn't have authority. The authority is not in the person. This is also the root of checks. because the check derives from the fact that those two have to match. Now, the Chinese system of checks, the six ministries, and the checks worked up and down and sideways. All this was introduced in the early 18th century, 15 years before Montesquieu. Montesquieu talks about, checks and balances and the separation of powers about 16, 17 years later. He reduced the 6 to 3, but in my view, he missed the most important point. He did not realize that the authority actually is in the office. It's not in the person. And so what we have in the modern world sometimes is an inability to recognize the conflict of interest, particularly in populist regimes or when a democratic government turns populist. Then authority is imagined as a kind of something that's transferred directly from the people to the candidate without a specific charge. Okay, it's just authority. And then the candidate can do whatever she wants with it. And then it becomes very difficult, even if the officer, for example, uses public office for private benefit or otherwise violates the charge. I think the public has a tendency to think, oh, but he has this title or she has this title. She's the governor, so we can't get rid of her. But in the Chinese view, this was much less of a problem. There are many cases in Chinese history where an official violates the charge, and the investigating officer says, "Well, when you did this, you acted in your private capacity. You weren't acting as an officer because your office doesn't allow you to do that." And so this is a crime, and we can get rid of you. I think that this conception, this understanding, along with the understanding of virtue as dedication to the public interest, not just not drinking or whatever, this possibly could help in the context of the current world. Let me just say one more thing. I'll make it brief. It wasn't just the notion of meritocracy that was learned from reading Chinese texts. Thomas Jefferson, for example, had over 100 translated Chinese policy documents, which repeat over and over all those things I just said. But even the terms. So when we use the term, say, talent or ability and virtue, where virtue means dedication to the public interest, those were 18th century translations of the Chinese terms 才德, because I've looked at the Chinese and the translation, and you can see that those terms were translated into virtue and merit and virtue in the 18th century, and then Rousseau, Jefferson, and Madison start using these terms quite regularly, and so it comes into the very political discourse that we now think of as American political discourse. Oops.
Go ahead.
Oh, yes. So let me just say one more thing about the checks. With Montesquieu, again, it's rarely pointed out that he does suggest a separation of powers for what he calls popular governments or democratic governments, but not for aristocracies and monarchies. He thinks in that case the aristocracy is restricted by their sense of honor, which of course doesn't tally very well with history. We know that these guys, were not restricting themselves at all. And so, but I think again, this shows that he didn't quite understand how this works. One last element in all this, of course, is public opinion and is the need for feedback. If your government is based on the idea that government promotes the interests of the people by appointing experts into the EPA or other essential agencies, then one way to determine how well they perform, of course, is to have checks of the sort that Dr. Yang mentioned. The other is to have direct feedback from the people. In Imperial China, there were a number of channels for direct feedback to the government. So people could blow the whistle on a corrupt official, they could complain about a policy and so on. And I gather that there is a similar system in China today called the Xinfangzhi, where online, people can go online and again, they can point to problems in administration. And this is absolutely essential for any merit-based system to perform properly. And again, it's rooted, all of this is rooted in China's past, as Dr. Yang has already said. Yeah, that's my opening.
Thank you, Professor Powers. I've got a ton of questions for you, but what I do before each speaker, I'll ask you just one question because I'm hoping that it will also prompt the next speaker to think about. You know, many of us have been brought up, particularly if we've been students of Western, we've been brought up in the Western education system, etc., which is, you know, well benefited from, etc. But you've also shed light that many of those thoughts were borrowed from different parts of the world. And I know Professor Shankar is going to talk about it. But can I ask you just one point? It's widely understood, even among Asian scholars, etc., there's a whole concept of reasoning, that reasonable thought was a product of the Enlightenment. You almost debunked them. So I'm curious myself as to what's the foundation for you coming to that conclusion? Because I've heard many say that reasoning was one of the most profound sort of upsides of the Enlightenment, and I never believed it. And I started to read, but you've actually said this now, so I thought whilst you're here, perhaps you could shed some light on how do you come to the conclusion? And I'm only going to give you a minute. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nair. That actually is a very helpful question. So the concept of reason, of course, is important in Plato and Aristotle, but they were speaking of God's reason, and the eternal reason, which shows itself in mathematics and physics and things like that. The early translations of the Confucian classics stressed reason a great deal, and it was clear to Europeans that this was not the Platonic reason. This was reasonable. And also, for the classical Greeks, ordinary people were not capable of thinking rationally, whereas for Confucius, every person has the capacity to acquire rational thinking. So this was fundamentally democratic. This is a very democratic idea. And it was picked up early on by people like Sir William Temple and other early Enlightenment figures as a very different notion of reason, where government should be reasonable in the sense that it promotes everybody's welfare, not just the welfare of a few people. And also, it was the secular aspect of it. It was considered reasonable in the early Enlightenment because it wasn't hobbled by various types of religious superstition.
Thank you, Professor Powers. We can come back to that. And also, I'd like to come back to the point you made about the notion of corruption and how it was viewed and captured and defined in China was also something that was understood more or helped an understanding in Europe. Thank you. So now can I invite Professor Shankaran. Professor Shankaran, thank you for being with us. We are delighted to have you here. And just so that I may just also let the audience know, that Professor Shankaran is an Indian academic, is a commentator, and he will explain to us that much of his studies has actually been been involved in explaining China and Chinese culture and its impact on societies through history, also to its impact in the Western world. So, Professor Shankaran, over to you. Your microphone's on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, now we can hear you. A bit louder, please. Yes, now we can hear you.
Yeah. Let me first thank you for organizing this China talk with your colleagues and inviting me for this particular discussion about China. Now, I have 3 points that I would like to present for the discussion. Only 3 points. I am not going to give a talk now, and when you're discussing, I can elaborate them. The first one is Chinese contribution to the development of European material culture. Chinese strong contribution. You have to understand that the Christian Europe was for a long period of time a spiritually and materially backward region in Asia. It was actually the Chinese. Is there a problem with my voice? Can you hear properly?
Yeah, you're slightly cutting out, but please carry on.
And what I was saying, that Chinese inventions actually helped Europe to generally look around other places. And Columbus and Vasco da Gama used Chinese inventions like compass, gunpowder, guns, and these were essential to move around. It's not that alone. In 16th century, for example, the Ming dynasty acquired large quantity of looted silver from America and the New World. It was tons of that. And that was the first time Europe started interacting with another country and started having a kind of a trade relationship with countries. Bullion was essential for them. They didn't have anything to sell. So they used bullion. They got it from New World and sold to China. China was actually in Ming time, Ming dynasty, it was monetizing. So they required silver. So that continued for 100 years. And also you have to understand that Chinese contribution in development of science. Without Chinese contribution, that is the printing press, there wouldn't have been any scientific revolution. I will come to that point later. And the next point I would like to talk about is Mao's and Deng Xiaoping's contribution into the industrialization of China. The Mao's part of it is normally not talked about. I would like to talk about that part. And the final point I would like to talk about, China now is supposed to classify it as a high-income country. And once it classified as a high-income country, would it try to redescribe it non-Marxist, non-communist terms, or continue to describe it in Marxian terms, calling it Chinese character, Marxism in Chinese characterization, something like that. That's the 3 issues I have for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Shankar. Can I now invite Professor Lok-Sang to speak, and then we'll come back to the 3 points you wanted to make. Is that all right, Professor Shankar?
Yep.
Okay. So, final but not least, Professor Lok-Sang Ho, who is based in Hong Kong and a very distinguished member of the community in Hong Kong. And Professor Lok-Sang Ho, thank you for being with us. Can I invite you to make your opening remarks, please?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm glad to hear that Professor Yao agree with me that meritocracy is also in a concept that is endorsed in the West. In fact, as we all know, President Lincoln had this idea by the people, for the people, and of the people. And what is by the people? By the people is election by the people. Of course, we know that elections will provide a sense of empowerment because people have the vote. Okay, but the essence of these 3 things by the people, for the people, and of the people is for the people. So the aim of the government is to service the people, to provide services to the people, to elevate the well-being of the people. And that is indeed common to the West as well as to the East. In China, of course, we know that Mencius, okay, who came after Confucius, had already said 民为贵, which means that the people must come first. And the institutions and the emperor comes last. Second comes the institutions. The last one is the emperor, okay, who rules the country. You see, so the question of what is meritocracy? Meritocracy means if it's merit, it has to be assessed based on the effectiveness in serving the people. Okay, so but unfortunately, I would say that there's a huge leap of faith, okay? Believing that election by the people will automatically give us meritorious leaders. But that is a gigantic leap of faith because of inherent human weaknesses that is shared by politicians and also the electorate. And that is why we've seen enlightened people like Jason Brennan, who had first written a book on the ethics of voting, suggesting that if you are not so informed, please do not vote. Because if you elect someone who doesn't have the merit, and he has huge power, and he can use his powers to further his own ends, and that can be detrimental to the interest of the people. Okay, and then later on, he wrote another book which is against democracy. Okay, and I had early on in 2010 published a book. Okay, co-edited with my political science colleague at Lingnan University by the title of Public Governance in Asia and the Limits of Electoral Democracy. You see, the platform, the idea that I advocate is that regardless of how the government is formed, the most important thing is what? Governance. Effective governance means prevention against power abuse, because as was mentioned earlier on by different speakers, preventing power abuse, making sure that public power is for public interest, and not for private interest. Okay, so there's a lot in common among humanity, and that is why Xi Jinping talked about this idea of a shared human destiny. And because we share similar weaknesses and similar strengths, and we have similar aspirations for well-being, for prosperity, for peace, okay, we remember that there was this slogan, one world, one dream, okay? That was the Beijing Olympic slogan, right? We all want prosperity, good health, well-being, and peace. But unfortunately, if everybody is looking after their selfish interests, then, as Mencius again said, the world, the country will be at risk. You see, we're talking about national security, but if everybody up and down are seeking his own self-interest, the country is at risk. And that's national security, you know, because the country is at risk. You see, and that is why we have to make sure that we have checks or constraints against public power. And unfortunately, in all of these surveys, China is considered to be to have extremely low ranking in constraint against public power. Okay, and also in public governance. This is amazing, you know, because they just make the assumption that because it doesn't use the ballot box to choose leaders, and that is why it doesn't have human rights, doesn't have public governance. You see, I think that's very unfortunate, and I applaud your organization because you're talking about global institute for tomorrow. Okay, so what we are looking for is a civilization culture, what I call civilization culture. What is civilization culture? Civilization culture is thinking about the well-being of everybody, okay? We need this for me and my kind culture. We don't need that. We want a culture of for us, for all of us culture, right? And unfortunately, there's this big leap of faith in Western politics and political scientists. And I saw a book review that was very critical of my earlier book that I mentioned. And they say the reviewer says that, you know, I don't endorse public governance, you know, because you don't have election. Okay, and that's a big leap of faith. If you assume that without election, without transition of power from one party to another party, you don't have constraint against power abuse. That's deeply wrong, as was explained by Professor Power, Martin Power. Constraint against power abuse is definitely ongoing and very strong in China, because of, you know, the constraint by culture. You see the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, admits members based on a culture test. You see, not everybody can sign up. Okay, I want to be a member of the Communist Party. Okay, they need to do different kinds of exercise to make sure that this guy has the culture of serving the people. You see, so the culture itself is a big constraint. Okay, and then there are other mechanisms like 实名举报, which means that you can report specific officers for power abuse. Okay, but you must spell out who you are. Okay, if you spell out who you are, there are mechanisms to protect you. Okay, so I think all of this, there's a lot of misunderstanding about China. And what I'm hoping is that this civilization culture is not just Chinese culture. It's a civilization culture for everybody. Okay, I think my time is up. Is my time up?
We will bring you in, Professor.
Okay,
I wanted to just you know, just comment on some of the things you said, that many of us who look at the world in the sense of you know, a greater unity, a civilizational culture, understand, and who lived close to China understand that it's much more complex than it's simply made out to be, because it doesn't have Western liberal sort of ballot box method of choosing the leaders. For all the reasons you've already explained in terms of the inherent risk. I just wanted to just say that one of the reasons we do these things, because it's so rare to find forums where we invite people from a diverse backgrounds, different cultures, etc., to explain the complexities of systems, but also to explain the sort of long history of China, which for whatever reason, and I think we know that you know, narratives win minds, and therefore the narratives around China for a long time have not been balanced and have not been objective either. So thank you for bringing that up, and I'll come back to you in a minute with a couple of things, particularly your question about the whole issue of the balance of power and how it's actually works in China with quite a lot of checks and balances. And I'd like you to comment later on the cultural checks. But before that, I wanted to, I had not allowed Professor Shankaran to elaborate on his 3 points. So Professor Shankaran, one of the points you mentioned you had 3 points you wanted to elaborate on. Can I ask you to elaborate on the third one, which I think is also interesting to what Professor Lok Sang-ho also mentioned, which was once China defines itself as a middle-income country, then how does it describe yourself? And I think you had a point there to make, which I'm not going to try and pretend to have fully understood and explained. So if you could make that point about it's going to describe itself in this way. Therefore, how does its culture alter, will it alter? And it's also the question I asked our keynote speaker. As China evolves and with technology, what does the next generation feel? And how does the state or the society maintain the positive aspects of its culture? So over to you, Professor.
I have my own reading of China. China in 20th century, that is after 1950, is borrowed Western ideology, which is Marxist ideology, and Mao Zedong introduced his own version of that. But that's a foreign ideology. And that foreign ideology allowed China to industrialize. The issue is that whether that was necessary, that's a different issue. Now, my point is that, as I said before, Western ideologies have a problem. They are immoral. All Western ideologies are immoral. And Chinese are not immoral. They are ethically oriented. And when Mao Zedong took over, and the Marxist ideology he used, introduced certain kind of a discipline, and that discipline was necessary for industrialization of China. He did two things. One, what he did was the simplifying Chinese character is simplified, and that is actually helped the working class in a very significant way. It helped working class. He had also the foot doctors, and that literally improved health condition of people in China. These are positive side of Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong, all of us, you know that he had he was a bad administrator. 25,000, 60, 70,000 people died. The famine, that's a bad administration. And Cultural Revolution was also a problem. But in the end of it, he gave to Deng Xiaoping a healthy, educated working population. That was actually a contribution of Mao. I am not saying that his administration was good. He did various bad things, but he was one of the figures to help China to develop industry because he gave them healthy, educated, literate working population. And when Deng took over, see, now I was just recently reading in 2010, China had 400,000, more than 400,000 foreign investors in China, according to American Congress's report. 400,000 is quite a large number, 400,000 foreign investors. And out of this, China had 100,000 factories. 100,000 factories means ancillary Chinese groups taking over, and that is actually made Chinese industrialization possible. That huge amount it, but there is a flip side. The Chinese workers, they're really that all capitalist countries, all capitalist development, all industrialization take away the same thing. That is, the workers would get exploited to the hilt. The same thing happened in China for nearly 35 years now. There is actually a serious accusation now that the strikes, 2023, there were, according to American reports, there are 400 odd strikes. And the conditions of workers are still bad.
Professor Shankaran,
Yeah.
the question that I'd like to ask and you to think about, because it's about the cultural aspects, because given that this panel is looking at the historical impact of Chinese culture on the external world and how the external world influenced China as well. So I want to come back to that point that you just mentioned earlier about how China influenced international trade and also international affairs, and particularly in the West. Let me leave that with you and go back to Professor Powers to ask him his the point that he tried to make earlier around, because I want to stick to the sort of panel one discussion, which is looking at the sort of history, the echoes of antiquity, and tracing China's historical cultural influence and impact. We focused a lot on meritocracy, but I also like Professor Powers' view to talk about ideas that took root and how the notion of what is right and wrong, in particular, Professor Powers, you talked about the issue about the institution being it's not the authority of the office. It's the authority of the office that is most important. And can you elaborate on that and what the roots of that are, and where else did it travel around the world? You're muted, Professor. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a penetrating question, and it goes back to this this notion that God, which again Dr. Yang mentioned, that God plays a very small role in much of Chinese culture. So if you're not relying on an external force to certify what is what, how do you determine this? So the Chinese have this saying, you've probably heard it, 天人合一, that is to say, society is part of nature. And this you find, and so morality is also part of nature. And this is brilliantly formulated in the Song Dynasty. I've spent some time studying a kind of a crib, a kind of a textbook for preparing for the civil service exams, and written in the early 13th century, the late 12th. And the author explains that if you look at nature, because there's no God, right? So if you look at nature, what is nature's tendency? It's the production of life, right? It's hard to deny that. That's what nature does. It produces life. And so therefore, the state and society must work together with nature in order to produce food for the people, in order to produce homes, bridges, and everything else. And his conception of government, which goes back to the Han Dynasty, I've written a book about that, is not that the government has a top-down relationship to the population. That's an aristocratic idea. The Chinese idea is that the two work together and as equals, actually. And this is how it's envisioned in pictures, that the people and the government are working together. Why? Because the members of government are drawn from the people, right? So if it's going to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, yes, indeed it is. This textbook says over and over, 皆为民, everything you do is for the people. And of course the officers are all drawn from the people. So yes, of course it is. So then how do you derive from this moral system, which clearly the production of life is a good thing? How do you recognize corruption? Well, it's very simple. When an officer's actions go contrary to nature by serving himself rather than the production of the people's lives, that is corruption. So here you have a moral system which has no God. It doesn't need God. It just starts with this idea that, look, we're part of nature. If we're going to survive, we have to work with nature. If there's no God, then no one has a right to claim they're more important than everybody else, right? And so we have to assume that everyone's life has to be included. And so this is what government does. Government works for that. And those officers who work for themselves rather than for the greater good, those people are by definition violating the public-private divide, and they're corrupting the system. I'll add that Thomas Jefferson arrived at similar ideas, quite possibly influenced by the Chinese text, because as I mentioned, he owned more than 100 of these policy documents, along with the Confucian texts and also a number of edicts in his library. And he also says that the land is given by God, he says, for the benefit of all men. And if one man's property rights extend so far as to deprive another man of a livelihood, then the state must step in and fix it one way or another. So this type of reasoning reminds me very much of what you'll read in Song Dynasty documents.
So, Professor, I think what you're saying is what some of us refer to as the Chinese system is essentially communitarian, that it is in the community as the starting point. And I think you referred to the work of the official is dedication to the public interest. So a quick question to you. There will be those listening to you and saying cynically, or perhaps, through their understanding, well, but China has had periods in its history where if this system did exist, or this was the civilizational core, well, how did that come about? So, very quickly, if you could just try and balance out that sort of remark, well, if it's so perfect, how come all that other stuff happened? I'm being a bit crass in my asking the question, but you see what I mean.
No, I understand. And that's a good example of, I think you've referred to as white privilege as one of the ways that white privilege is maintained. And of course, there's a confusion there. Jonathan Israel has talked about this. Sometimes people make the same complaint about Enlightenment thought. They say, well, gee, that sounds very good, but it's not always executed. But a thought can be useful. A political principle can be useful, even if it doesn't always work. But I think there's another problem with that question, and behind it is an understanding of culture that's based on a kind of a substance metaphor, where Chinese culture, everybody is made of the same substance. So if they did a good job in the Song Dynasty, how come they're not doing a good job here? And of course, it's not a substance, it's a collection of practices and ideas and institutions which sometimes work and sometimes don't. And one of the great insights of the Chinese tradition is that officials are fallible, and we saw that with Dr. Yang. They make mistakes. The emperor is fallible. Chinese emperors are constantly apologizing to the people for messing up. And everyone is fallible, which is why we need good checks built into the system. But even so, as Thomas Jefferson himself points out, even the best designed system doesn't work all the time.
Thank you, Professor. Very good. Professor Roxang, I hold over to you.
Yes.
I think you had a lot to say there about the fact that you want to govern, and that's what we want governments to govern. And what do we want them to govern? I've often said that the point is to govern so that the outcomes allow for the majority of society to live with dignity and not suffer from the daily drudgery of life. And that's why we have government, so that people can have lives of dignity, access to resources, and not suffer from drudgery. And you made the very important point that when you then give power through elections, that's a huge leap of faith. Could you elaborate on your thinking with regard to that? And particularly also help us understand what you said, that the prevention of abuse of power is very strong in China, and you mentioned that there are factors. You alluded to culture. So could you respond to those points that I make?
Okay, a few points. A few points. The number one point that I wanted to stress is that in the Chinese culture, there's a lot of emphasis on sincerity. Okay, you don't want to say one thing and do another thing. Okay, that has been stressed over and over again. And in the Confucian literature, there's this line which says that 诚意, 正心, etc., etc. The first condition must be sincerity. Okay, for one to cultivate himself. Sincerity is the first precondition in order for one to have growth. You know, because if you're insincere or arrogant, okay, then personal growth is finished. You can't grow into a bigger self. Okay, you just keep thinking about yourself, and then you are only thinking about your self-interest. You're not serving the public. And then there's another point that I want to stress, which is the understanding of public interest. I have a book, Public Policy and the Public Interest, in which I define public interest in terms of John Rawls' theory of justice. Okay, he was advocating this mental exercise. You imagine that you forget your identity, okay, which means that you have to put yourself in the position of everyone in the community, okay? And then if something, supposing you are going to introduce some policy, okay, you imagine that you could be anyone in the community, so you would be affected by that policy or that institution, and you're going to accept it, okay? Now, if you forget about your identity and think that, okay, this is a policy, this is an institution that may affect me, okay, because I have equal chances just like everyone, okay, to be affected by this policy or institution. Well, I'm going to accept it, okay? If you really can put aside your own self-interest, you forget your identity, then you will approve it only if it is for the public interest. Okay, so that is a very important consideration. So it is public interest is not weighing some people's interests against other people's interests. Some people are more important. That's why we give them more weight. You see, everybody is exactly the same weight. So that's impartial view of the action or the policy or the institution. Think about slavery. Okay, if think about you see what causes the Civil War. Of course, there was this in America. Of course, there was this interest which is tied up with slavery and slave trade and other interests. But if you could be a slave, then you would object to this institution. Okay, so I would say that the Declaration of Human Rights is based on that kind of consideration. You put yourself in the position of everybody. Okay, in that case, you are impartial, and then you have the public interest in mind. So the government has to govern according to this principle. You see, and that is how you should define people. You should not look at, okay, this is my people. Okay, that is not my people. That is not people. You can't have that. Okay, that is why we must transcend. Okay, when I talk about civilization culture, which I would mean that we must transcend the boundaries of ethnicity. We must transcend the boundaries of nations. We must transcend the boundaries of religions. Okay, we're in the 21st century already, so we must not be beholden to the ancient text of the different religions, which are, of course, contradictory. Okay, and if I subscribe to this word for word, I'm a fundamentalist, and you're a fundamentalist and of another religion, so we'll fight forever, right? It doesn't work. We must subscribe to civilization culture and transcend these boundaries, and then we can have a sustainable tomorrow.
Very, very well said, Professor. We got 15 minutes left, so I've got some questions here for all of you. So I'm going to start with Professor Shankaran. Professor Shankaran, a question for you is, you have looked at the history of China, and you have looked at particularly the impact China had on Western civilization. You mentioned that. You've also just before talked about the sort of the embracing of capitalism and the threats that could happen. But the question here is one that is, I think, intrigued at how does an Indian intellectual look at the relationship, and we are particularly looking at the sort of long tracing China's historical cultural influence. And the question is, how did China and India impact each other going back over the last several centuries? And your particular take on those things. I think most of us know the generic stuff about the religion, Buddhism, and all of that. In China, India is highly regarded for for all of its traditions. But could you give your own take? I know you have your own views on these things. Did Chinese philosophy influence India? How did Indian philosophy influence China? If you've looked at those, that's the question.
Let I answer that. Just before that, I would make a comment on what other panelists said.
Yes, please.
That Confucianism, except in the case of Sun Tzu, all Confucianists had a take on heaven. Heaven is considered to be a deity, and even Analytic also treat heaven a deity, except Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu is actually a non-metaphysical thesis. All other Confucian theses are metaphysical. Now that is it. And now I'll try to answer your question. That India actually contributed more than China contributed to India. Now, India contributed only in this sense. Buddhism went from India to China, and Buddhism became very big in China. So now you have Neo-Daoism, which is also Buddhist place in it, and also Neo-Confucianism, which is heavily influenced by Buddhism. So Buddhism, even in contemporary China, Buddhism plays a major role. And Confucianism, of course, culturally major thing, but Buddhism is a very powerful presence in China. And also that Chen Buddhism, there are a large number of Chinese, but Chen Buddhism is actually, many people believe that it is the initial thing came from India. Initial ideological positions came from India. And also that China, for example, the place I live, Kerala, China's influence is for large number of the cooking utensils are Chinese, and also Chinese fishing net. These are Chinese, and also the Chinese travelers who came India, they wrote about their travels and what they found in India, which is actually a historical document. Say, ancient India is largely covered by somebody from outside and gave us some insight to what was happening in those days. These are actually solid contributions from China. And politically, if you are asking that, what is the current political situation? Now, you cannot have that kind of a Confucian kind of a harmony between India and China now. China, this is one thing I want to say, the end of what I was talking about, that China is trying to become more and more Confucian. See, now in the 200 onwards, you would see that Chinese government is encouraging Confucian vocabularies and trying to get that into governmentality. See, which is essential for China in the sense that if they are shifting from Marxism to something else, because there is a problem of Chinese military. Chinese military is Communist Party's ministry. So that has to be that Confucian, what you call the vocabulary, should also be part of the military establishment. Otherwise, it will create problem.
Professor, one quick question on that. I think people would be very interested. We talked about, Professor Powers talked about how the Chinese ancient sort of systems and the bureaucracies were then, the documents were used by some of the American leaders, etc. So can I be so cheeky and ask you, since the meritocracy issue, and we have said that despite the belief, Professor Powers has described it very well, there have been the failings of people mean that there are periods when there are crises, and there are external influences as well on all the countries. Do you think for a minute that that emphasis on meritocracy is also something that the Indian system has, because we said in ancient times, but the new India didn't exist before the colonial period, as some would say. I just wanted you to comment on whether, everyone says, why is Chinese system working for a large population, but the Indian system? So I couldn't resist the temptation of asking you that question. And again, like Professor Powers, I'm asking a difficult question, but I'm going to ask you to summarize in 1 minute, please.
No, this is interesting in the sense that kind of a meritocracy is not possible in a democracy.
Right.
It's impossible. But only in a dictatorial system. China is a dictatorial system, and nothing wrong in a dictatorial system to improve its economic conditions. Europe did that. South Korea did it. Japan did it. China did it. And these are all dictatorial systems. And within dictatorial system, you can talk about meritocracy. In India, you cannot talk about meritocracy. We have to give seats to various groups in this country. They're all not doing very well. So government has to look after them, going to give them jobs. So you cannot pick up elite group and give them job. So meritocracy doesn't work in India in that way. Meritocracy won't work in the kind of in a rich democracy. Meritocracy will work, but a country like India is not a rich democracy. It's a middle-income democracy. So meritocracy won't work in India.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for making that point as well clear. And also, we can have a larger discussion about what is a dictatorship, etc. I know Professor Lok Sang Ho has his hand up. So, Professor, if you're going to respond, I'd welcome that as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have defined a substantive democracy as a government that responds to people's needs and wants. Okay, so if you're responsive, then you're not dictating your will on the people, okay? Because you're responding to people's needs and you're addressing them as they show up, okay? So what you do is actually guided by the people who show what they need, what they are worried about, and then you just address those. And as to which is effective or not, that is dictated by science. And that is why I very much endorse, this principle which was advocated by Hu Jintao, okay, which is called the scientific outlook of development. You see, because when you make policies, you have to follow science, the science of the societies, the science of how the society works, and the science of nature, all of that. And you're following the dictates of the science, of the laws of nature and the laws of society, okay, and the laws of human nature and so on. You have to address that. And I wouldn't call that dictatorial. So I don't think China is success is based on its dictatorial policies, but I think it is based on pragmatism, based on understanding of how market works, how the nature works, and so on. It has to capitalize on the laws of nature and the laws of society. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think these definitions from the Cold War and from the ideological sort of camps that were generated over the last 60, 70 years with so many of us still need to dissect them. I'm fascinated by the young man who was elected the mayor of, is it New York?
Yeah.
Defined by many as a communist. That's so funny. But Professor Powers, I know you want to weigh in on this. So let me invite you to comment on what you've heard so far. It's been a really interesting conversation. More questions coming in. But we got about 10 minutes left. Over to you, Professor Powers.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I also feel uncomfortable with the authoritarian moniker for China. There is an American philosopher and to me a sociologist also, Naomi Zak, who defines democracy as a government very much as Dr. Ho just did, as a government that responds to the needs of the people. And her view is also very meritocratic and in many ways can mention, I don't know if she's read mention, she doesn't mention it. But nonetheless, this is her view. Also, I would observe, as I've spent many years studying aristocracies and aristocratic-like governments that are ruled by small numbers of people at the very top, a very small oligarchy. And these, even if they wanted to, typically they cannot serve the interests of a broad section of the population because they don't have the expertise. A handful of people who, in many cases are there precisely because they have no expertise other than gaining power, are not going to be investing in infrastructure, medical care, stimulating the economy, and all the things that the Chinese government does very well. These decisions can't possibly be made by just a tiny number of people at the very top. My understanding is that the Chinese government consults experts at all levels. They call it consultative. I'm not an expert in that, but I can see the results. I've been living in China for 3 years now, and I've been coming to China for 40 years, and I can tell you the improvements are really quite astounding. This is something that an authoritarian government could not accomplish. They simply don't have the means to do that. So we have to come up with a better term, I think.
Yes, I agree, and it's not germane to this discussion, but I have frequently said that authority should not be a bad word either. All
right.
units, including the family, depend on some form of authority. But again, narratives have taken over. And the point of this sort of forum that we're having, this is a series, this is the third year we're doing this, is to get us to dissect this in the way we've done so far and create new narratives because narratives and terms have become so powerful as well. So in ending this, we have about 5 minutes left. I would like each of you to comment on a couple of things, going back to the sort of why we have the title of this conference today, the Chinese emphasis on culture. It's a manifestation of nationalism because we've all said there's been an emphasis. All of you gave different examples of that. Is it a manifestation of nationalism or return to basics? Our next panel will be starting to look at it from a more contemporary point of view. And therefore, for you all to make your final statements in terms of China's historical cultural influence and impact, and how is that influencing China's current emphasis on culture and its manifestations, and how should the rest of the world read the tea leaves with regards to where China is going on that? And that's really the essence of this discussion. In terms of governance, if you could comment on this issue that I believe what has been said, and you emphasize it, Professor Powers, that you can't achieve it simply by being authoritarian or a dictatorship. You have to have competence, and competence requires a dedication to achieving outcomes for which you build. And I've had the privilege of working in different parts of the world, so I would also agree with that. So could you all take a couple of minutes to round it off with your final remarks, coming back to the foundations of why we're here, and to leave people with a clear impression about what it is that Chinese culture is now doing in terms of, given its history and in terms of its impact on the world. So perhaps I can start first with Professor Lok Sang-ho, then with Professor Shankaran, and finally with Professor Powers. Professor Lok Sang-ho.
Okay. First of all, I want to point out that some time ago, the Communist Party of China has redefined the CCP with the so-called 3 represents. Okay, you've heard of that, huh? It represents the development trend of China's advanced productive forces. Okay.
Yes.
Represents the orientation of China's advanced culture. Okay. Represents the fundamental interest of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. Okay. Now, I think this is extremely important, because the Chinese Communist Party says that, okay, even the law, the judiciary, and the legislature should be under the leadership of CCP. Okay, and to a lot of people, this is unthinkable, because you can't have a political party in charge of these things. Otherwise, you have abuse of power. You don't have checks and balances. Okay, but if the CCP culturally stands for these things, okay, and if you betray this, it means that you're not following the CCP. Okay, then you can understand that even the law, the making of law, and the judiciary should indeed follow the dictates of these 3 represents. Okay, so I'm talking about dictates of these 3 represents, which means that whoever who violates these things is not in line with the CCP's policy stance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lok Sang-ho. Thank you so much. Professor Shankaran, your take on both the discussion, but also the sort of concluding sort of remarks I've invited you to make.
I don't agree with at all what these other panelists said. I don't agree with that. To me, politically, it is not possible to have that kind of a industrial development happen in China without an extremely strong government, which is even now, it is very, very strong.
Yes.
I don't have an objection to that. I don't want to conceal that fact. The concealing that fact is not going to help anybody. Even Chinese is not going to help. And China is a great country. China is a great country. China is a great civilization. And most likely after 20, 25 years, China might rethink a communist party's hold on that. I don't think that current communist party is actually a communist party the way I imagine.
Yes.
It's not. It is communism with actually Chinese characters. Chinese characters. And I'm sure that after 20, 20, 30, 40 years, Xi Jinping itself says that after 50 years, it will reconsider. It will reconsider. It might become rich enough to become something like Song Dynasty, a largely Confucian dictatorship, a benevolent dictatorship. That is what China could imagine China could end up, a benevolent dictatorship. China cannot give up dictatorship. China, a benevolent dictatorship.
Thank you, Professor Shankaran. The word dictatorship is the authoritarianism is the one that we can all debate, but I think your point is very well made, and it's an important one for everyone to appreciate as well. Professor Martin Powers, the last word is yours.
All right, thank you. To get back to basics, the 9th century historian Liu Zongyuan and the 20th century sociologist Charles Tilly both came to the conclusion that there are really only about 2 types of authority. One is personalized authority, which you find in aristocracies, fascist systems, and things like that. And the other is the one I mentioned, sort of the tally model, where authority has to be in the public interest and is held to a standard. I think as China comes back to these old discoveries, and of course other cultures have embraced them also in the last couple of 100 years, I think that is offering a really important alternative at a time when many nations are going fascist, which is basically the personalization of authority in the interests of a few people rather than the larger community. Now, I don't want to make too sharp a binary, and there's no perfect solution on either side. But this is an issue I think it would benefit us to pay attention to.
Professor Powers, very, very important closing statements about the nature of political sort of, I don't want to call it progress, developments in advanced economies, where power is being concentrated in the hands of a few, and essentially to benefit a minority, and that will create huge difficulties. And in that sense, this discussion has been very rich talking about China. We've had a great rich discussion about then how the world will look at that, and we've had differences of opinion, which is why we gather. We all agreed it would be a pointless exercise, but it's been a rich discussion. And as you were saying, the last remarks you made about the trend in advanced economies, I saw Professor Shankaran nodding in agreement. So I think that's a very good point at which we can end this. And I'd like to thank you all for participating. So Professor Lok Sang Ho, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated it. And next week I'm in Hong Kong. Let's take fun if you have the time. Professor Martin Powers, thank you so much for your time. And if you're in Hong Kong or Beijing. And Professor Shankaran, thank you so much for adding a very important voice and a different dimension to this discussion. And I believe that the India-China, we didn't discuss it, but the India-China relationship will very much define the rest of the 21st century, both from a civilizational point of view and a geopolitical and political economy. So thank you, everybody. Now I'll hand over to our moderator, Fidas, to begin the next session. So please don't go away, everyone. Lots of questions coming in. Please stay on. Fidas, over to you.
Thank you, Chandran. And thank you once again to Dr. K.P. Shankaran, Professor Martin Powers, and Professor Lok Sang Ho for your holistic insights on the rich history of Chinese culture.
It's not clear. Your voice is not clear. Your voice is not clear.
Oh,
Your voice is breaking. Your voice is breaking.
Oh, can you hear me now? All right. So allow me to continue on the session. So for our second panel, titled From TikTok Refugees and the Hanfu Movement to Statecraft, the Forces That Are Shaping Chinese Culture Now. To discuss this theme, we have an exciting lineup of panelists. Allow me to introduce Professor Chun-Mei Du from Lingnan University, Dr. Heather Inwood from University of Cambridge, Ms. Sarah Mao from the Culture Atelier, and finally, Mr. Brian Wong from Radii Media. I am also delighted to introduce all of you to our moderator for panel 2, a renowned poet, writer, journalist, translator, and the founder of Pusaka and Kala Publishing House, Mr. Edin Koo. Once more, if you have any questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box below. Mr. Koo, over to you. Mr. Koo, I believe you are muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a bit of an idiot when it comes to technology, so I do apologize. Yeah, it's a great privilege to be able to moderate this session, which is very provocatively titled From TikTok Refugees and the Hanfu Movement to Statecraft, the Forces That Are Shaping Chinese Culture Now. I think it's quite an interesting conceit that a Southeast Asian is asked to moderate this session because the South China Sea is widely predicted to be the next zone of great conflict, whether cultural or military or resource-based. Also, there's a large Chinese diaspora that has become very attached to the rise of China in the past 2 to 3 decades. Things like TikTok have become some of the major political tools that are defining the mode of correspondence and political culture in the nations of Southeast Asia. Let me just introduce the various speakers, and they will each have 6 minutes to make opening statements. And I will introduce them very briefly. So we'll have Mr. Brian Wong, founder and CEO of Radi Media and managing director of the Aspen Institute China Fellowship Program. We have Ms. Sarah Mao, who's an auctioneer and founder of the Cultural Atelier. And we have Dr. Heather Inwood, who is Professor of Modern Chinese Literature and Culture and a Fellow of Trinity Hall, University of Cambridge, and Professor Chun Mei Du, who's Head and Associate Professor, Department of History, Lingnan University. Perhaps before opening statements, there can be a provocation. Many years ago, I was present at a interview with the Chinese filmmaker Zhang Yimou at the British Film Institute soon after his many decades ago success of films like Raise the Red Lantern and To Live. And he was asked a very pointed question about censorship. And he talked about being a citizen and the need to grapple with and confront censorship in all its appearances and forms. But he also regarded or referred to or spoke of censorship as perhaps being his most creative tool, in the fact that he had to look at the world and look at artistic channels in so many different ways. When we talk about continuity of culture in China, and especially in this age of when China emphasizes soft power, we remember also whatever we feel about him, Ai Weiwei and his famous dropping a Han Dynasty urn, and how that is either disruptive or a aspect of the continuity of Chinese culture. The question that I suppose people from Southeast Asia ask is whether that soft power is hegemonic or whether it is one that comes from a kind of historical continuity that has influenced the South China Seas, but now also affecting the rest of the world. So perhaps I can get the speakers to intervene with their opening statements. And you have 6 minutes, and perhaps we could start with Brian Wong.
Thank you so much, Mr. Koo, for laying the context. Yes, so my name is Brian Wong. I'm founder and CEO of Radii Media. Many of you probably are wondering, what is Radii Media? It's a digital media platform that we started 8 years ago in the Greater China region to really provide a lens and a window into what's happening in young China today, particularly amongst youth culture. And I think that's very apropos, given you brought up TikTok and kind of how raised the question of how Chinese culture is being shaped today. I think the panelists in the prior sort of conversation really laid out sort of the roots and the foundation of Chinese culture. And now we fast forward a few thousand years and we look at what is China today in light of the world and the modernity that it's really reached. And the question is posed, what are the forces shaping Chinese culture? I'm going to keep it brief in these opening remarks, but I'd say that China's cultural influence is now being pulled by two forces. Top down is the deliberate statecraft that builds domestic and export rails and guardrails. That's the top down vis-a-vis government, and bottom up is a faster, messier surge of bottom-up scenes, games, toys, platform, fashion that travel further because they feel native to the internet. And I use the word internet specifically because I want to lay out 4 points that are really defining Chinese culture today. The first is platforms as portals and what I call the reversal of the firewall. You talked about TikTok refugees. There was also the Red Note migration that happened when TikTok was threatening to being threatened to shut down. And what that did is provided a window for many Americans and people overseas into kind of a new China. And I would say that this sort of reversal of the firewall was really providing organic encounters that are driving soft power or China's soft power faster than official diplomacy, this sort of top-down effort. This has given the rise to something that some experts call an algorithmic cosmopolitanism versus traditional cosmopolitanism, which was dictated by diplomatic relations and sort of propaganda narratives. In a digital world where content is presented based on users' likes and preferences and interests driven by algorithms and not a national agenda or narrative that the state defines, this sort of cultural exchange is much more organic. It's much different from what we've been used to in the past, and it often has no conscious intent. So this sort of platform as a portal is one phenomenon, and people diplomacy vis-a-vis these platforms are basically the new cultural embassies, not built by governments, but actually by technology. And we can get into that more. The second is the rise of hybrid aesthetics. You talked about sort of this Hanfu revivalism, so to speak. And we can look at heritage as innovation. Many of the previous speakers talked about kind of Chinese culture and history, and that is actually experiencing a revival. Mainly because China's young sort of creative generation is looking back to its roots, to its ancestral and traditional culture, but they're mixing it in a way that is very unique. We're going to talk about kind of video games and movies and fashion. Black Myth Wukong is going to come up. Ne Zha 2, the film, the highest grossing animated film ever. Black Myth Wukong was the highest grossing AAA video game ever. These are emerging with a mix of heritage plus modernity. You can look at the latest Adidas line, The Power of Three. They just released last month. It's one of the best-selling sort of fashion brands that mixes Hanfu jackets with Chinese streetwear culture and fashion. So this is an interesting creative hybridity that is sort of indicative of what's happening amongst youth. And then third, I'd say statecraft versus statecraft and soft infrastructure. As I mentioned at the beginning, China, rather than building sort of traditional soft power relying on narratives like Hollywood style or CNN News, they tried that at the beginning. I don't think it was so successful. But now what they're doing is building infrastructure and platforms that are the pipes by which the culture is distributed, but it's actually the organic kind of grassroots youth that are filling those pipes. And then finally, culture under constraint, innovation in a machine age. As someone referred to in the last panel, despite what people would call constraints or even censorship, youth are actually leveraging this dynamic and becoming even more creative in how they express themselves. There's coded language in how they talk, how they act, how they dress. And there's vibrant subcultures that we cover in Radii all the time, whether it's Ghost Fire Boys, who are young kids who basically soup up Yamaha motorcycles that are and take dangerous acts and film them because they're trying to express themselves within a confined sort of social economic environment. Too cool fashion, bureaucratic shit, countryside aesthetic. We can talk about these fashion styles that are coming out and the language they use because of this machine age. So that's how I would summarize my view on what's shaping Chinese culture today and how it's spreading through the world.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. That was very illuminating. I think we're going to return to some of those things, in particular, the reconstruction of heritage and other questions about young people and a kind of almost chaotic anarchist approach to reinventing culture. I think I'm going to open and invite Sarah Mao to make her statement, please.
Hello, and hello, everybody. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here and be part of this conversation. My name is Sarah Mao, and I'm based in Hong Kong. I've spent over 15 years at an auction house as a Chinese modern painting specialist. I've also spent time leading art and luxury education programs in Asia and also developed strategic partnerships in the region. I now lead my own consulting collective called the Culture Atelier, and that's really focused on empowering clients and corporations to create their cultural identity through collections, education, and legacy planning. So the majority of my career was really at the intersection of Chinese art, education, and cultural strategy. And I think for myself, I'm always struck by how Chinese culture continues to evolve in ways that are both deeply rooted, in history, but also unexpectedly fresh. And I think I kind of concur with a lot of things that Brian was saying just now as well in the reinterpretation and the newness of how people are kind of expressing their culture and identity through social media and different channels. I think when we talk about cultural resurgence in kind of those terms, I don't think there's a single moment that really captures the mood. And with the previous panel, I think one of the speakers talked about the transcendence of boundaries of religion and nations. And I think art and culture is definitely a wonderful way to weave narratives and to build soft power through that. A few examples I wanted to share during my opening statement was kind of during COVID. An auctioneer called Miss Chen Liangling went viral on Chinese social media. And it was really through her now iconic wearing qipao while conducting sales in English, Mandarin, at the same time. And I think that was not just about her fashion. It wasn't just about kind of the auctions and the high prices it commanded, but it was really that combination of reclaiming elegance, heritage, and authority. And through that, I think kind of the algorithm somehow kind of really amplified both her presence on social media, but also amplified the cultural mood and kind of that acceptance and enjoyment of her kind of positioning herself in that manner. So I also see kind of a lot of, when we talk about Han Fu movement, I also see how kind of museums are curating different stories, whether it's the San Xingdui exhibition that came to Hong Kong Palace Museum and now has a museum itself. For example, it wasn't just about kind of preservation of relics and artifacts and bronze masks. It really kind of brought history to life and kind of were symbols of identity that were reimagined for today and for kind of a much wider audience. From kind of moving on to collectors, for example, very notable Chinese collector Liu Yiqian and his wife Wang Wei also established private museums in China. The Long Museum, for example, in Shanghai is a brilliant example of that narrative and juxtaposition of both art and storytelling. Collecting both Modigliani paintings next to Ming tapestries to tankers and iconic paintings and that chicken cup. So the acquisitions are not just about trophy collecting, but they're very, very provocative and really sets a great tone and a backbone to how cultural conversations can be held in China and how kind of storytelling can integrate different cultures and different kind of ways of narrative. So beyond China, kind of from where I see, there's also so many different kind of exhibitions that are showcasing, China's cultural heritage from the past. So exhibitions at the British Museum, at the Met, and weaving them into contemporary artists. I know you mentioned kind of Ai Weiwei as well. So it's also kind of a wonderful way to shape how Chinese culture is understood, remembered, but also reimagined in kind of this new contemporary lens. So whether it's kind of talking about Dunhuang and Buddhist sculptures, and that cross-section of understanding, kind of appreciating Buddhist sculptures, but also a lot of viral photos and Instagrammable, red note spots of people riding camels. I think it's also become very participatory rather than being kind of passive understanding of culture, and invites people to take a part of it. So that's kind of pretty much what I want to share for the beginning, and I look forward to the conversation that's going to follow.
Thank you, Sarah. Lots of things there to raise as well, in particular, the politics of these conversations and the politics of institutions and private collections and what they actually say about the identity of Chinese culture within particular locations. But let me call on Dr. Heather Inwood to give us her 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me today. It's wonderful to be here with you all. So yes, I'm an associate professor at the University of Cambridge, where I teach modern Chinese literature, popular culture and cinema. And what I want to talk about today is drawn partly from my own research, which I'll say a bit about in just a moment, but also partly from my experiences teaching students from the US, the UK, and from China and Hong Kong and elsewhere in the world over the last nearly 20 years or so, and how impressions about China and the topics students are interested in writing about Chinese culture have shifted over the last 20 years. So just a quick word about my own research. My first book was about contemporary Chinese poetry, and I was very interested in the ways in which contemporary kind of avant-garde poets are navigating this new digital media environment in order to form communities and explore new ways of making poetry meaningful in the digital age, which was often quite kind of boundary pushing. So I was looking at this explosion of poetry writing in the early 2000s when poets were very excited about these as we were just hearing, these more participatory modes of engagement on the internet. And my current interest is in contemporary popular fiction, particularly online genre fiction. So I've just finished writing a book about what I call netfic, Chinese internet fiction, all these weird and wonderful genres of popular fiction that are being consumed by hundreds of millions of readers in China and increasingly elsewhere around the world. So there's much more I could say about that. But my talking points for today, I think my biggest interest is in this gap between what Brian just referred to as the more top-down uses of culture and these more organic bottom-up uses of culture, not just in mainland China today, but around the world as well. And where the question of coolness comes in, what makes Chinese culture cool in the world today? Who perceives it as cool and why, and on what kinds of terms? And I think very often the types of Chinese culture that are being produced that really resonate with audiences globally are the kinds that don't seem to have too much of an obvious kind of statecraft intent built into them, that are not kind of really explicitly trying to promote traditional Chinese culture or perpetuate a particular narrative of cultural continuity or anything like that. And some of the video games, for example, and the online novels, which really strike a chord with international fans, the Chineseness in them is not necessarily all that obvious to begin with. So I'm interested in how soft power actually is most effective, I would argue, when it occurs in a very organic way and when audiences themselves get to determine the stakes and the reasons why they find culture appealing. So if I bring that back to my engagement with young people over the last 20 years, there's been quite a shift in the last, I would say maybe the last 5 years, in the kinds of students we're getting applying to Cambridge to do Chinese studies as an undergraduate degree. And it used to always be the case that the Japanese studies department would have a lot of students who were drawn to Japanese studies because of, J-pop and anime and manga and the Japanese otaku culture and the sense of Japanese coolness. But actually, there's been more of a shift towards students applying to do Chinese for similar reasons nowadays. So they're becoming fans of particularly danmei fiction on the internet, but boys love fiction featuring two male protagonists in romantic relationships. They get deeply involved in these online fandoms surrounding these types of, quite socially progressive genres of popular fiction. And that's their initial exposure to Chinese culture. It's not anything traditional at all. It's something really very contemporary and in their experience quite edgy as well. So this coolness is emerging not from a very top-down statecraft approach to culture, but from something much more bottom-up and organic. And I think that's where a lot of the potential will lie in the use of Chinese popular culture for kind of increasing awareness of Chinese culture around the world. So yeah, the second point related to that is the Chineseness essential in the first place? Or is Chineseness just a kind of a secondary characteristic of texts that are appealing for other reasons other than the fact that they originate in mainland China themselves? So that's what I would say to begin with.
Thank you, Heather. There was, again, lots of things to return to, in particular, the restlessness of young people and what that actually kind of would lead to. Finally, I'll call on Professor Chunmei Du to give us her 6 minutes before we break into conversation and questions.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Gu. My name is Chunmei Du. I'm an associate professor and head of the history department at Lin Nan University, Hong Kong. My specialty is modern Chinese intellectual and cultural history, so I hope to bring some historical perspective into this dynamic panel discussion. To start, I want to just offer 3 quick points about our panel theme, what's shaping Chinese culture today, based on my personal experience, research, and observation. First, I think the Chinese diaspora and youth are powerful cultural engines in this transformative process. Overseas Chinese, especially students and young creators, are acting as cultural messengers and interpreters. Through platforms like TikTok and Red Note, they carry ideas across borders and remix and reinvent them into something at the same time hybrid and while being original. So take the so-called Hanfu, Han costume revival movement as an example. Even though, and I would argue, perhaps because they are abroad, many students have organized public events and built communities that pushed Hanfu into global view. And then they bring them back into China with new meanings. So this intermediary role is not new. Since the 19th century, students educated overseas have been catalysts for China's political, economic, and cultural transformations. One of the spokesmen of Confucianism in the early 20th century is an overseas Chinese from Southeast Asia. He was educated in Britain and then discovered his Chineseness only in his late 20s. And then that brings me to the second point, where this revival energy comes from, and whether it's a product of organic growth or deliberate statecraft. So I would say culture has been central to the Chinese Communist projects from the party's very beginning. Both for internal nation building and for projecting a global image. There's no question about that. So it has always been the core. So policy, funding, and infrastructure matter. But we should also distinguish between state nationalism and grassroots nationalism. So state nationalism is top-down, planned, institutional, and in contrast, grassroots nationalism is more bottom-up, more spontaneous, and in the digital era, it's often amplified by user-generated content at a massive level and at an unprecedented speed. So grassroots nationalism follows its own cultural, economic, and I would say emotional logic. Sometimes it overlaps with state goals, but other times it diverges and even pushes back. We have seen incidents where, Chinese anime fans wearing Japanese kimono in public were condemned. These are moments where bottom-up emotions kind of outpace official messaging. So if that's the landscape, what does it mean for China's soft power? So my third point is that soft power grows from everyday life. Much of China's cultural influence now travels through micro-level content. Fashion trends like Hanfu, like cooking videos, neighborhood scenes, everyday lives, the kind of stuff that feels authentic and connective at the personal level. So this kind of soft power is often more effective than formal propaganda campaigns. And that has policy implications. The state should prioritize people-to-people exchanges, make room for authentic stories, and stay attentive to lived experiences and human connections. So to sum up, if we want to understand and engage China's cultural development and influence, I think we need to watch what happens on the small screen and at the micro level as closely as on the big diplomatic stage. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. I want to return to that notion of emotional logic. I think so many of the things that we're discussing here are actually subliminal in nature. And I suppose when you talk about TikTok and TikTok refugees and the whole digital experience, it's giving the term samizdat a whole new impression. But I'd like to urge listeners, please, to, if you have questions, to post them up here, and I will post them to the conversationalists. But in the meantime, perhaps I can gather everyone together and we can begin a kind of conversation, and with a few provocations from things that had been said, I will use moderator's privilege to perhaps ask the first question to everyone. Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, for example, we've had a very long relationship with both the great powers between the trade winds, that is China and India, both of whom have announced kind of soft power policies in recent years, overseas Chinese, overseas Indian citizenship, that kind of thing. And there's been a great deal of debate in the past just a few months actually, about what the nature of Chinese influence and what the nature of Indian influence has been on China, on the Southeast Asian region over the centuries. Southeast Asia, of course, possessing one of the largest Chinese diasporas and not insignificant Indian diasporas within its region. My question to the panelists is really quite direct and simple, which is, should we fear soft power?
I'd be happy, Mr. Koo, to jump in on that, if that's okay. I don't think we should fear soft power, but rather celebrate it so far as it enhances our lives in whichever country we're in. I just actually ironically came back from Penang 2 days ago. And one of the things the group and I were admiring is the fusion of cultures that exists in that state, in Georgetown in particular, the richness of the blend of Malay, Chinese, Indian, European, and Middle Eastern. And in the way that it harmoniously integrated. And, we argued that Chinese sort of globalization, Shuhai, is not happening now. It happened over 200 years ago in Southeast Asia. And we can see the beauty and the impact of that that improved and made the civilization even more rich and diverse. So I think so far as soft power can enhance a local culture, it should be, really valued, and then figure out how that can really be a positive for the local community. And I think one of the things, particularly as an American Chinese who grew up in the States and spent 25 years in China, you sort of can see the best of both worlds, and you almost hope that both countries can take the good from each and integrate it within their communities. And I think at this time, both sides could benefit from a little bit more of what each provides.
Anyone else willing to respond to that?
I could say something next. I mean, I agree that soft power in itself is not inherently bad, and in as much as a culture can be used to enhance mutual understanding across cultural divides, then of course that's a positive thing. But if we go back to the original definition of soft power put forward by Joseph Nye in 1990, then we need to remember that the purpose of it is ultimately power. It's not softness, it's power. So he defines soft power as the ability to obtain preferred outcomes by attraction rather than coercion or payment. So I suppose the question we need to bear in mind is, what are those outcomes that are being desired by any given country when they're employing soft power for particular purposes? And are those outcomes beneficial to the countries who are buying into the soft power, or the regions who are buying into the soft power? And I can certainly think of cases where the soft power maybe is at odds with some of the actions that the US government might be taking in certain parts of the world that are not beneficial to local populations. And the same is case for many countries. Same is true of many countries, of course. So, you know, culture, the global spread of culture, I would say is something to be welcomed, but one should always bear in mind why soft power is being promoted in the first place.
Culture, of course, there is that great dimension when we talk historically of Chinese world interaction, particularly in Southeast Asia being an example. I, for example, am part Chinese, and I come from a community that is known as the indigenous Chinese, who came around the 15th century, settled here, adopted Malay dress, spoke the Malay language, forsook the Chinese language. The question, I suppose, and perhaps I could ask Professor Chunmei this question: what is the line between organic cultural interaction and, as Heather was talking about, the state's intervention, which then could make culture hegemonic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if we put it in the extreme way, I would say it's very hard to draw the line between the so-called organic outgrowth from civilization and kind of deliberate promotion by the state or any official agencies. So if we put to the extreme, I would say there perhaps is nothing called the purely organic outgrowth of civilization. But putting that aside doesn't mean distinctions cannot or should not be drawn in a real setting. So I think I agree with Heather said. You have to look at the goals. You have to look at kind of the hegemony. You have to look at what kind of tools are used in the process. Right? So the soft power, I mean, in the context we often use it is in the nation, is in the kind of states and diplomatic international relations. So your question, whether we should fear soft power, I imagine comes from a place that's the other, right? Outside China, the world. And that's why there's the question, should we fear China's soft power? So it reminds me something very different. So in after World War I in Europe, there was kind of a fear of kind of what they call the Eastern civilizations, Oriental civilizations, cultures, and mostly they were talking about religions. And then, of course, the more familiar we have civilizational clashes, right? Can civilizations coexist? Can they collaborate? Or fundamentally, they will clash? They are often, discussed and debated in a different context, not necessarily in sort of in the international relations and state operations. But I think they're also connected in a way. So when we talk about soft power, right, it's has to do with kind of the fear of China's the non-soft power, the real kind of expansion, right, in the geopolitics. And there's definitely that fear. It's not about culture itself. But on the other hand, underneath, it could also have something to do with this kind of clashes of civilization or religions or kind of more essentialized views of culture and civilization.
Question, my follow-up question, and I think I hope people who are in the study of language and could intervene, is when we talk about China, the diasporic experience is quite different because there's no one China. There is representations of many China, many Chinas, and it's the rise of China has seemed to have had an effect, for example, on marginal cultures, marginal languages. For example, the death of dialects being replaced by Mandarin so Mandarinization in many diasporic societies. So Professor Chinmay, I mean, what China are we actually talking about, especially for us on the outside? And maybe Sarah could also experience this being in art and the experience of the many Chinas as compared to the one.
So perhaps I could use Hanfu, the so-called Han costume as example. So is that the one China? Is that the dominant China? Is that the real China? Right? So it's termed as Han costume. It's supposed to be the costume of the Han people, the majority of the population, right? In contrast to perhaps, the Qing, the Manchus, and obviously not the minorities. But obviously it's a hybrid version. It incorporates many of the contemporary fashion aesthetics, as Brian was talking about. This hybrid aesthetics, I will even go one step further. I will say hybrid identities, not just the taste and style, but the many ingredients. So to what extent is the Han? I would say, but it's modeled, it's branded and it's promoted out as authentic Chinese costume and promoted both in China and abroad.
Yeah, Sarah, I wonder if you could add to that. Given collections and museums and so on, what is the Chineseness that is advocated and advanced, or what is the Chineseness also that is being sought?
Yes, I mean, I think I kind of agree with also what kind of Dr. Heather was saying about soft power, and definitely with art and exhibitions, the narrative that they want to weave and where they're weaving it, of course, kind of is of imperative importance to them, whether or not it's kind of a private-owned museum in China or whether they are kind of international exhibitions being held kind of across in Europe and the US. What I wanted to kind of pick up on just now was on that diasporic China versus mainland China, and the differences. I think a very easy one, of course, is us being in Hong Kong, or myself being in Hong Kong and speaking Cantonese, and that kind of pull between speaking Mandarin or learning Mandarin or being as one with kind of that wider Chinese audience. So whether or not you maintain that cultural identity of what you feel is being Chinese and speaking Cantonese. So I know this is kind of less about the art, but I did want to kind of chime in on that point as well. And definitely there is that sense of loss, I believe, when we try to kind of see a uniform kind of movement of what Chinese or what Chinese culture really is. I think you really kind of hit the point on what happens to diasporic China, where they actually hold very fast to those cultures and more kind of specific cultures that are specific to a particular dialect or specific to a particular kind of county. When we extend and speak about art and culture and museums, I think it's very clear. I think if you just look at the statistics on how many Chinese or national exhibitions or collections have been has been exported in the last few years, it's dramatically different to, I think, kind of pre-COVID times, where you had exhibitions at the Metropolitan and say at the Royal Academy in the UK, where it was very much a celebration of Qing dynasty or kind of Han movement. And I think now there is the selection of exhibitions is actually more historical. So in the past, where you would kind of have a 100-year gap and have contemporary Chinese art exhibitions, and then you'd kind of skip over about 100 years and go back into the Qing dynasty. I think now you notice a lot of exhibitions outside of China will be very much focused on archaic or kind of even older cultures, focused on Dunhuang, Old Silk Road, or kind of Tang Dynasty exhibitions. And I think, you know, going back to that idea of what message they want to take from a top-down perspective, I think that's that's clearer when we look at the type of art exhibitions or curations that's happening. Something, again, kind of completely unrelated to art, but I think if you think about grassroots cultural kind of proliferation and sharing, one just needs to think about bubble tea, for example. And in the past kind of 15 years ago, you're hard pressed to find bubble tea in kind of a small town in France. But now you go to kind of, I think, any small city or town that doesn't have a Chinatown or K-town, and you'll still see shops that sell bubble tea. You'll still see shops that already kind of have these kind of Chinese snacks, not just kind of in Asia, but kind of beyond as well. So I'd be really interested to see what Professor Chumei and Heather and Brian feel about that as well, from a soft power perspective.
Can I just pick up on one point you made about the surge of exhibitions, particularly in the West, in major institutions, that they are largely historical. Is there a sentimental bias to that, a kind of nostalgia that kind of mollifies what China was, or, you know, and tries to ignore what it actually is?
I think it is a celebration of what they want to show, right? I think, as Professor Chumei was saying, you know, what is Han? Like, if we think about kind of the Qing dynasty, that's not, we think about kind of true Han movement and the Han people, you have to go back to the Ming dynasty, right? So where they want to spotlight, I think that becomes the top-down direction, like how they want to spotlight and where they want to spotlight beyond through art and culture, I think is very strategic, and is very selective in celebrating moments of bringing kind of art and culture as a celebration through Buddhist art, you know, Dunhuang, for example, through kind of archaeological finds with Sanxingdui, to kind of emperor, you know, the rise and fall of kind of emperors. So definitely that's strategic.
Hopefully we can return to that. I've more questions, but there is a question from a member of the...
Edin, sorry to interrupt. Can I just kind of piggyback off what was been said?
Please.
Yeah, so I think the question about diaspora is interesting because it gets to this concept of what is China versus Chinese-ness. And, you know, I think one of the really interesting things about the Chinese diaspora is the role it's played in preserving Chinese culture in a traditional sense. So, I mean, you would know very well in Malaysia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, even parts of US Chinatown, where traditional Chinese culture has really been preserved, where in mainland China it's been destroyed or is no longer present. And this idea of China versus Chinese-ness, one is a national political identity, one is a cultural identity. And so if you talk about soft power, I think Dr. Inwood brought up something very important, is what's the intent of the state versus what's just the effect of the culture. And we're sort of seeing a blend of both of those things. And I think that's really an interesting phenomenon, because as China has become more powerful, there's been growing pride in Chinese culture, but that's manifests itself in both the political and kind of the cultural way. And which is more influential? I would venture to say that it's still very much the Chinese-ness that appeals to the larger global audiences. And then when you talk about nostalgia, this is also interesting because Sarah brought up how, you know, these auctions, there's a growing interest, or, you know, certain aspects of the art are trending. If you look at China, the nostalgia that's coming from heritage and tradition, and even something as recent as Y2K nostalgia. If you go to Hong Kong, you go to China, you're going to see like all these young people kind of going into vintage things. They really admire that. That actually is a response to a modern world, which is 996. It's job insecurity, it's stress, it's a technology sort of disruption. And I would say that nostalgia in China from the youth is being driven by the societal pressures, where they need a psychological sort of safety, I don't know, sort of anchor that whether it's traditional Chinese heritage like Hanfu or it's vinyl records, they are embracing this because it's a response to a rapidly changing and disruptive technological world. So I just thought that would be interesting to add to what's been shared.
Extremely. I hope we can come back to that. But I've got a question from one of the listeners. I will preface the. She did write, and I should say this since it's credit to all of y'all, that this is an amazing session. But her question basically is, what is the role of the Chinese diaspora in adding to the idea of Chinese coolness? Brian, perhaps you could come in with this.
Yeah. Again, it's coolness. I love the fact that Dr. Ng would also study this, because I actually tried to deconstruct the word, and we'll save you the technical details on that. But coolness is something that a lot of people aspire to, but never actually reach. And one of the things I'll point out is the diaspora and what its relationship is to Chinese coolness is the fact that the diaspora actually has both a Western and an Eastern, or an inside and outside perspective. And so in some ways, they are unique to the Chinese culture because they see both. And ironically, Edin, there was a Malaysian Chinese who coined the term Sino-futurism, Lawrence Leck. And it was a Chinese diaspora person who came up with a term that really embodies and describes what's happening in China today. It's a deviation or the antithesis of Orientalism. It's Chinese Sino-futurism is what's happening in China today with EV cars, flying taxis, 5, 6G, robotics, AI. China, in a way, is defining the future. It's no longer following the future, and it's not an anachronistic term of the past, ancient China. When you thought of China in the past, you thought of terracotta warriors, calligraphy, and tea. Now, when you think of China, you think of EV cars, robotics, and AI, and modern-looking cities. That is Sino-futurism that was defined by a Chinese diaspora person. And we're going to see more of that in the future because they have a unique perspective on what China is and becoming.
Dr. Heather, do you have anything to say on, could you tell us a bit about what you think Chinese diaspora coolness is?
Yes, very much so. Actually, I think it'd be worth even thinking a bit more about the word diaspora, because it's a word that's been challenged a fair bit in academia over the last couple of decades. Professor Xu Meishi has written very persuasively against the use of the term diaspora, because it seems to imply there's still this home base in mainland China, and that there's this kind of pull back towards the motherland. Whereas perhaps what's actually more important are the languages that people speak, and their cultural identities, as well as their sense of rootedness in the countries and the regions and the cities where they live now, which in many people's cases, despite being labeled as Chinese diaspora, might have been generations ago, that they last actually had a connection to China. So diaspora itself can be a slightly problematic term, I think, in some ways, in that it implies this tethering back to China, which may not actually speak to people's everyday experiences and identities in many parts of the world. But in terms of the role of, let's say, heritage speakers of Chinese languages in the plural around the world, or people who have some family connection to Chinese culture, I think they, as Brian was saying, I think these people are playing an incredibly important role in kind of mediating China for other communities around the world. And a lot of that mediation is taking place through language. So a great example of this is the role of Chinese speakers, say in the US and the UK and Canada and Europe, in translating Chinese internet fiction into English and other non-Chinese languages. And they're not just translating the text in a way that makes sense to the local populations and languages outside of Chinese, but they're also translating the cultural references and making sense of it for these different readerships around the world, and kind of, in a way, making it possible to become cool, not necessarily making it cool, but making it accessible, and thus allowing it to continue to have a life of its own once it's left its language and culture of origin, once these texts are able to travel more freely in different communities. So a lot of the most influential translators have been heritage speakers of Chinese, who are also obviously very conversant in the cultures and languages where they currently reside. And there's lots of really interesting kind of cultural fireworks going on in the communities around fan fiction, as people encounter Chinese historical facts and references and things for the first time, and mix it up with their own interests and experiences, and all kinds of interesting things are emerging as a result of these interactions and collisions.
Okay, as I wait for other questions, let me just pose this to you. I'm very interested in the language, Sino-futurism, algorithmic cosmopolitanism. So I'm very interested in exegesis, because what is the enduring or staying power of such terminology? I open it up to, well, Brian, you were the one who brought up algorithmic cosmopolitanism. So what is the enduring power of such language?
Well, look, I think these terms define a new world that we're venturing into. And just to riff on a language theme, the latest joke at Facebook is, to be a successful AI team member, you need to know 2 languages. One is Hack, which they use to do the programming, and 2 is Mandarin, because everyone in AI is from Tsinghua. So, but that's a side note. I think that what's interesting is that these terms are being defined kind of in Western language, but they're descriptive of a world that the Chinese culture, and particularly China specifically, are creating. And, algorithmic cosmopolitanism is an export of, you could say, is an export of China, because the content was created in China and it's being distributed through Chinese platforms, TikTok and RedNote. Of course, there's some on IG, but the whole point of this is that, you're taking the human element out of it, and suddenly you've got this algorithm that's defining how people interact, and that is a whole new phenomenon. Sino-futurism is just taking the elements of what's happening in China today that, probably Lawrence Leck dreamed about in the early 2000s when he coined the term, but now it's a reality. And so I don't know. I don't know if it'll stay with us for 10 years. I mean, some say it's already out of fashion, but I think those are the clubbers who had a whole view of Sino-futurism in terms of nightlife. But I think in terms of everyday society, it's very much there. And what it's going to become is really going to be defined by how these societies evolve.
One of the reasons I ask this question of endurance is when you're dealing with not just terminology, but such fleeting experiences in culture, what is its enduring power, especially when it comes into confrontation with the state? Anyone, please.
So you're asking, what is the enduring power of culture?
Of what is going on at the moment, given its fleeting language, given the transient nature of its experiences, when it comes into confrontation with this enduring power of the state.
The it being Chinese culture.
Yes. Good. Contemporary, cool, young people's Chinese culture.
I'm not sure if what I'd like to share is going to answer that question, but I wanted to kind of bring up what you asked just now about kind of coolness and versus nostalgia, and maybe that kind of is kind of that will somewhat kind of answer that notion of culture. I think what Brian said just now about EV cars being really cool and kind of the next stage in AI and the development of all that is incredible. But I think what social media or what kind of what is being put out there, actually, there is still a kind of a great gap or a chasm between the true identity and how people are feeling. And I think that's and the reasons why people go back to revert to nostalgia and sentimentality. A kind of easy example is a friend of mine who works for Tencent, and he's 40 years old, and he's like, I should have retired at 35 because you can't find a job after 35 in China, right? Going back to Brian's 996, the whole notion of kind of working till you collapse and working, you working full throttle for the sake of that futuristic China, the progressive, technologically advanced China. I think that whole kind of picture and, what Heather talked about, kind of all these stories, the huge influx of reel shorts now and storytelling really is, it is a great lens to see the imagined or the idealistic China. But when you bring it down to, the people and you look at kind of their livelihood or how they perceive their own future, I think that is in some ways the reason why there's so much nostalgia and so much sentimentality to that culture or the Han Fu movement. And that's kind of just something that I wanted to chime in.
I think following on from the previous conversation, I don't know what I'm doing, but yeah, okay, now I've got everyone on the screen. Following on from the previous conversation, there was a great deal of talk about the state in a traditionalist sense, notions of the Communist Party and authoritarianism. Are such conversations, given what we're speaking about now, coolness and artificial intelligence, young people, are such conversations kind of anachronistic? Is the language dead already, talking about authoritarianism?
I think the stronger the authoritarianism, the higher the level of coolness if you can speak against it in a way that is coded and acceptable, not acceptable, but whenever you ask young people what is cool, they say, when you see it, you know it. You just know. And that's the common response. So if you look at what's happening right now, to answer your question, Edin, what's the durability? The durability is it will last as long as it can evolve and dynamically shift as the environment shifts. And it will continue to shift because, like I said, there's coded language, there's coded behavior, and only the young people know it. And that's what makes it cool. And then, as I think Sarah mentioned just now, this stress, you're going to have people opting out. This trend, right? This whole knee trend is this grind is going to push certain people into other subcultures. Like there's a whole camping life culture. There's a whole there's all these cultures where people opt out because they don't want to be a part of that. That becomes a subculture in itself, and that is cool. So it's not that Sino-futurism has to remain as the one thing that everybody does. There are responses to it that young people will embrace, and then they have coded language, behavior, and style and fashion and behavior to demonstrate and embody that. And many of those become cool. Like Shamate, I don't know if you've heard this. It's a group of migrant kids who go from the countryside and they go work in factories. They make, little money, but they have a whole style where they spike their hair in like bright colors. They wear really crazy clothes, platform shoes, and they take videos of themselves doing crazy things. And, that is their form of self-expression. These are migrant kids who don't have a great future, yet they've created something of interest and community for themselves. You have, these kinds of phenomenon that are happening amongst youth that demonstrate that, yeah, the coolness will continue as long as they kind of evolve and transform with what's happening.
Heather and Professor Chinmay, where is history in all of this? Where is, for example, Sun Yat-sen or Lu Xun? Where are they in the consciousness of young people? Apart from posters, which I myself have and I can buy, they've become memes and things.
So where are young people in sort of the Sun Yat-sen and Lu Xun's vision for modern China?
No, I mean, where do Lu Xun and where does history in the form of things like the May 4th movement, Sun Yat-sen, Lu Xun sit in the heart of young Chinese people today?
Oh, what are the roles of history and traditions in the current cultural imaginations, right?
Mhm.
That's your question. Well,
Kind of.
sort of create new, you need the old, so-called old. Especially if you want to create Chinese culture, authentic Chinese culture, you need to incorporate, adopt, refer to the Chinese cultural elements and historical traditions. Again, the concept of invented traditions, right?
Mm.
So sort of you borrow from them, but a lot of that has to do with what do you need in the current environment, and then you mixing with kind of different, the East, the West, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Korean, the Southeast Asian. And that's why we were talking about, overseas Chinese, why they play such important role is because this creative hybridity, it has give them advantage, but also give them kind of allowing them to do more, to transform, but in a way that is understand, and that can be legible by multiple audiences for people inside China and outside China, right? So they basically speak in multiple languages and put them in a way, regardless is the Hanfu, it's bubble tea, it's the Hei Wukong, the new video games, right? They have to put in them in the language that are legible to the global audiences. If they're only speaking the Mandarin in the local dialects, they're not going to sell. I mean, they're not going to communicate. They're not going to echo. So, so history and tradition do play a very critical role in this. And, but I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about your earlier question, if I may. I don't have a good answer to it. It's more like I want to ask the panelists who have more experience in this. So the algorithm cosmopolitanism, right? The AI, and authoritarianism, sort of techno authoritarianism, more so nowadays, right? The technology, but that's the old question, sort of, right? Does technology enable, or does it enable more grassroots and agencies, and or does that enable the state? And where does global capitalism play? I mean, what role does global capitalism play in this story? I haven't heard money, but this is something I would like to hear. And perhaps some of the panelists who have more experience in this. We can't just talk about culture as culture or just culture as the state. And there's an important part missing here.
I'm happy to jump in on that quickly, and I'll leave time for others to share. Professor Du, I think it's a very important part of the system. It's part of the state pipes that promote culture, whether it's intentional or not. But commercialism is a huge driver of these platforms, whether it's digital content or product. And look at Labubu, for example. Sure, there was a creator of the doll, but the most powerful thing about it was its commercial model, blind boxes and hype through commercial distribution. And the same thing is with like Haiti and these different food products. Like what makes them unique, what makes them powerful is their ability to brand and distribute. And these companies are highly efficient because they're very gen in China, and then they go globally, and it's like it's a walk in the park for them. So they're developing the muscles to create brands, to create distribution, to lower costs. Same with EV, all these technologies. And when they go global, they're very well equipped, which becomes part of the system that is the what I talked about, the rails of this statecraft cultural export. That would be my take up on how this plays into culture, the commercial aspect.
Exactly the same could be said of internet fiction, of course. China's exported the model for premium consumption. So the Qidian model, whereby you subscribe to read novels online and pay a small amount and you get the regular updates sent to your app. The same model's being used with the international version web novel. So international readers of Chinese internet fiction around the world are adopting exactly the same way of consuming and paying for content, as has already proved to be so successful in mainland China. So, I mean, of course, that's part of statecraft, right? Exporting the particular economic models that are powered by global capitalism is the way of making sure that the culture spreads as far as it does and makes as much money as it does. And the global readership of Netfic is now making huge amounts of money for Chinese internet fiction platforms, but it's also making money for the authors themselves. So you now have authors of Netfic around the world who are writing Chinese internet fiction in languages other than Chinese, using a Chinese economic model and adopting genre norms and tropes and Chinese names, Chinese place names, Chinese historical context in their own novels. But the authors themselves are not necessarily Chinese at all. So that's a very interesting merger of kind of global capitalism, Chinese economic models, and mixtures of cultures coming together in a both quite top-down planned way, but also a very bottom-up spontaneous way that creates genuine enjoyment for people involved.
Yeah. I think we've run out of time, but we do have maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Would that be possible? Could everyone just kind of give me it's been very broad, very expansive, many things we could have touched on, like money, Professor Chunmei, but could someone everyone kind of give me just a one-liner of about, how we could wrap this up in your from your point of view? Let's start with Brian. You started off. Let's one is done with you as well.
Look, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I loved all the topics we talked about. I would say that this clash of state and grassroots is not necessarily a clash. You could call it a convergence in China, and that the players are figuring out a way to blend these together in a way that works for both. States have intention and they have aspirations, but I would say that what's really fascinating about China is that it's a multi-dimensional game that the grassroots are also playing with quite a bit of success for their own intentions. And then if you layer on the diaspora and how that fits on, we've got a very interesting mix, and I'm looking forward to what is ahead.
Sarah, please.
It's a difficult one to wrap up. I think probably on the consumerism, I think probably one thing that we didn't touch upon was the kind of real-time live stream broadcasts that China's so kind of well known for, especially on like 11:11 times, where they're live streaming for 13 hours and that being kind of a culture and kind of dimension in itself. But definitely I think kind of all the different kind of conversations we had probably leads back to something that the biggest reflection for me would be sitting within an auction house and seeing how the inflows and outflows of art is being kind of decided and placed, whether Japanese museums are choosing to deaccession their pieces for the sake of their own culture, or international museums actively or even aggressively purchasing, art pieces of pieces of Chinese art to broaden and strengthen their collection. I think that's something that I would love to share and talk about kind of in later times. And I really enjoyed the conversation with all the different panelists.
Thank you. Heather, perhaps you could surmise.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I have also really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much to my fellow panelists for your really insightful comments. But I was thinking that, when we're talking about top-down kind of statecraft-led uses of culture, I think if we're looking from a top-down perspective and our question focuses to begin with on the role of the state, then we're going to see the role of the state, and we're going to see top-down uses of culture. But the more interesting thing, I think, is always to look at the culture itself, to look at the actual products, the actual texts, the phenomena, the viral memes, whatever else it might be, and talk to the people who are actually consuming it, enjoying it, spreading it, producing it. And then the story becomes much more nuanced. We shouldn't only be looking at the kind of questions of control and hegemony. We should be looking at the processes of participation and how we as humans find very human, very idiosyncratic forms of pleasure in our engagement with culture. And that's not specific to any particular country.
Thank you. Professor Chinmay, and then we'll wind up.
Okay, thank you. So I think the forces reshaping Chinese culture today are, as we talked about, it's kind of a creative hybrid process. It is moving through channels that might seem unexpected, but I will also argue they're also familiar and historically continuous. The diaspora youth acting as cultural brokers, the revival of tradition that blends grassroots energy with statecraft, and soft power built from the grassroots level. And I think that's where the next chapter of China's cultural story is being written. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. It was very lovely meeting you. Firdaus Chandran, I will wind up now. Zoom has always been a torture chamber for me, and this is no exception, but I had a great pleasure. And from one of our listeners, it was an amazing session, apparently. So thank you all very much. Hope we can keep in touch, and thank you for listening, and thank you to GIFT.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Koo. And thank you, Professor Du, Dr. Inwood, Ms. Mao, and Mr. Wong for your illuminating analysis of the Chinese culture and its impressive influence from the grassroots in China to the global stage. Now, this marks the end of the final conference in our three-part series, Shattering Paradigms, China and the World. A huge thank you to all of today's outstanding speakers for their contribution, and a special thanks to our partners. Now, before you leave, we would like to remind everyone that the recording to this conference will be shared on GIFT's YouTube channel, GIFT's LinkedIn account, and the event website. We are also pleased to share that GIFT issues a monthly newsletter that offers our latest insights, programs, events, and even reports. We also have a second newsletter called Tomorrow Matters, which features curated articles from local writers in Asia on a range of topics such as local and regional politics, economics, and history and culture. You can subscribe to our free newsletter on our website and via the link in the chat box. Finally, please give us your feedback after this session ends. To get a chance to win a free copy of Understanding to See You Again. Now, Chandran, we'll see you off.
Thank you, Firdaus.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you, everyone. And then thanks for a wonderful session and for moderating so well, despite being trapped in a tech torture chamber. Since I'm in KL, why don't we go and get some mama mee tomorrow, which is a mixture of Chinese tradition, Malaysian, and Indian. So that brings it all together. All I want to say is, I think we've had a fantastic afternoon, 3 hours of intense conversations. That's the whole purpose of this. The simple question that this whole virtual conference is about was simply this: Chinese emphasis on culture. Or is it a manifestation of nationalism or return to basics? And we covered so much from the first panel, covering everything from geopolitics right down to the Chinese culture. And everyone, I think, could argue that other cultures have the same, and we touched on that. The Chinese cultures of virtue, meritocracy, competence, etc., serving the community. Is that serving China well? Is it what it has transformed China? And can it be applied to other countries as well? And the historical context. And then in panel 2, thanks to every one of you. I listened to every bit of it, by the way. Was wonderful in terms of looking at contemporary China and looking at all the implications of that, including, of course, the real role of the state, but also importantly, as Professor Du mentioned at the end, the role of money, because money influences culture, as we all know. And as someone who's always wondered about this question of soft power, and that term essentially quite so often associated with American power, I've always worried that that the rest of Asia and other civilizations would be swamped to that tsunami of culture, soft power, including fast foods, junk foods, and all of that. And it's very good to see that the world is essentially embracing not just Chinese culture, but we've seen other cultures also being embraced all over the world. So it's been an extremely rich conversation. And all that I've left to do is thank everyone for turning up. Typically, we've had tens of thousands of people watch both on streaming, and of course the recording will be made available to everyone. I have a list of partner organizations to thank. I will not go through all of them. They know who they are. We'll put them on our website. And I hope that you will all join us again for the next one. And Sarah, that's a Chinese painting that I bought 25 years ago. So I'm going to invite you over to come and tell me what it might. I'm not selling it, but I'm just interested to know what you might think of it. But everyone, culture, China, manifestations of nationalism or return to basics. We cover the whole spectrum from all parts of the world and inputs from everyone else. So thank you for coming. Brian, thank you as well. Dr. Inwood, Sarah, and Dr. Du, and Edin, my brother, thank you so much for being with us. Take care, everyone. And to the audience, I hope you all enjoyed it. I've had lots of messages from friends from all over the world, including from Italy, from Africa, etc., saying this has been a wonderful conversation, and they wish we had more time with both panels. So thank you. I'll sign off now. Cheers, everyone. Have a good evening or good day wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Recording stopped.